Forensic Science Lecture 2-3, Dealing with Physical Evidence. Collecting and packaging physical evidence. Physical evidence can be anything from a massive object to a microscopic tissue. Many may be obvious in their appearance, while others may only be detected through examination. For this reason, it's important to collect all possible carriers of trace evidence, such as clothing, vacuum sweepings, fingernail scrapings. All of these have the potential to have evidence in there that can be useful to investigators. In collecting the physical evidence, investigators have to handle and process the physical evidence in a way that prevents any changes to the evidence through either contamination, breakage, evaporation, accidental scratching or bending during the transport process, or improper or careless packaging. Use of latex gloves, disposable forceps, and sanitizing equipment reduces the chances for these contaminations, but even if it was not handled with care and these objects were used, they can still contaminate. Whenever possible, one should keep evidence in its original condition as found, which gives the forensic scientists a better idea of the crime scene since they weren't there. Packaging physical evidence is key to keeping it uncontaminated. And so even if they're different items or similar items that were collected at different locations, they have to be kept in separate containers. And this prevents damage through contact, as well as preventing cross-contamination. Evidence collectors have a large assortment of packaging materials and tools ready for them for any situations. A lot of them travel with what's known as the mobile crime laboratory or crime scene search vehicle, which has everything that they need. The mobile crime laboratory is a little misleading because they're not doing any of the experiments in there. That is only carries the equipment they need to collect the evidence from the crime scene. Handling evidence. Disposable forceps may have to be used to pick up small items. Unbreakable plastic pill bottles with pressure lids for hair, things like hair, glass, fibers, and other types of trace evidence. Manila envelopes, sealable plastic bags, screw cap glass vials, or cardboard pill boxes are adequate containers for most trace evidence. The reason why ordinary mailing envelopes shouldn't be used is because they tend to have small holes in the corners, and powders, fine particles, they can all leak out of those corners and the evidence can be lost. Some amounts of trace evidence can be packaged in bindles. Bindles are also known as druggist folds. And when we're dealing with any sort of arson evidence, it needs to be packaged in an airtight metal or glass container. And what this does is prevent any loss of vapors from the evidence that can be collected and analyzed. With biological evidence, these cannot be stored in an airtight container. And this is because the moisture may encourage or cause the growth of mold, and then mold can then destroy the value of that evidence because it can alter the material. Whatever the material is needs to be air dried before it's packaged, and then typically stored in things like wrapping paper, a manila envelope, or a paper bag. With DNA evidence, contamination is a key concern during the collection of DNA containing specimens. They can occur by introducing foreign DNA through coughing or sneezing onto the DNA. If items are incorrectly placed in contact with each other, can all contaminate it. So to prevent contamination, the evidence collector must wear a face mask and a lab coat, use disposable latex gloves, work with disposable forceps, disposable overalls, shoe covering, eye protection. All of these will help prevent any cross-contamination or foreign particles into the specimen. DNA evidence tends to come from blood, saliva, sweat, or skin cells, and so it's a very delicate process of collecting this evidence. One of the key aspects to evidence collection and transport is the chain of custody. Chain of custody is the list of people who come into possession of the items of evidence. Continuity of possession or chain of custody must be established whenever evidence is present in court. This means that every person who handled or examined the evidence and where it is at all times must be accounted for. Otherwise, that evidence becomes inadmissible in court. So chain of custody needs to have an identification of the item, location of evidence that the evidence was found, the collector's initials, and the date of the collection. Every individual who possesses the evidence must maintain a written record of acquisition and deposition. So when they received it and when they transferred it over. Obtaining a standard or reference sample. Standard reference samples is a physical evidence whose origin is known, such as blood or hair from the suspect. And this is used to compare to the evidence that was collected at the crime scene. It can be collected from the victim, the suspect, or any other sources. Samples that work facilitate the work of the forensic scientists. Samples can be hair from the suspect, whole blood or buccal swabs from a relevant crime participant. A buccal swab is a swab of the inner cheek used to determine DNA profiling. Or a substrate control, which means that an uncontaminated surface close to the area where the physical evidence was deposited. So, like in an arson investigation, the accelerant is if accelerant is suspected in an area, a sample of the same area taken but not believed to have the accelerant on it needs to be taken as well. And then these samples are used to compare the evidence that came directly from the crime scene. The next step is submitting the evidence to the lab. And evidence is usually submitted by personal delivery or by mail shipment. Most laboratories require an evidence submission form that accompany all evidence. And this is information on this form helps enable an analyst to make an intelligent and complete examination of evidence. Care has to be taken when packaging evidence that will be sent by mail in order to prevent any breakage or any other accidental destruction during the transit to the laboratory. This is an evidence submission form. There needs to be a brief description of the case, particular examination that are required of the evidence. However, they're not bound, the analyst is not bound to these examination. New evidence may be uncovered, or an analyst may find that the initial request is irrelevant or incomplete and needs to examine or perform more examinations. A list of the items submitted for examination also needs to be accounted for, and each item should have been packaged separately and assigned a number or a letter listed in order on the form. When dealing with a crime scene, safety is key. Crime scenes frequently present investigators with biological specimens of unknown origin and no way of gauging the health hazard. So investigators must use caution and protection at all times. Latex gloves and possible chemical resistant clothing, shoe covers, a particular mask or respirator, goggles or face shield can also be worn. And then there needs to be a red biohazard plastic bags for any disposal of contaminated gloves, clothes, masks, pencils, wrapping paper. It should all be available, or those red biohazard bags should always be available to dispose of those correctly. Investigators also need to be alert of any sharp objects, knives, hypodermic syringes or needles, razor blades, or similar items, because this can open them up into to infection. And of course, drinking, eating, smoking, and chewing gum are prohibited at the crime scene at all times. And lastly, the departing of the crime scene. So the lead investigator decides when all of the pertinent evidence has been recorded and collected. A final survey is done to review the scene and to make sure that all evidence and equipment has been collected. And then the crime scene is released to proper authorities. So usually to the investigators, the detectives, the police department, so that they can then take it from there. This is the end of 2-3 lecture. There will be a quiz next class.